Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series, where we use our AI, DesignEye, to give us some feedback on designs that I have done for competitions in the past, and we look at what improvements could be made to those designs based on the AI's assessment of the design. As always, the designs are looked at using the principles and elements of design, which is how you are judged when you are in a competition. This week we're looking at a design that had the class title of Red Centre, and it was an Australian themed competition, so it was about the red centre of Australia. It was staged on a square plinth which is 60 centimetres in dimensions, and we were allowed 60 centimetres. So what that means is that even with the height, we should be looking at pretty much a cube, and that anything that is elevated in the design mustn't go outside that invisible cube of 60 centimetres. Roses were the only flower that could be used in this design, and that's part of this particular competition, is that one day, it goes for 10 days. So one of the days you can only use roses, one day you can only use dahlias, one day you have to use Australian native plant material. So this day was the roses day, and it is judged all around, which means that it has to look interesting from every angle. Now when I put this design together, I really wanted to do something very different, very out there, and as you can see, I managed to do that. It's actually two plastic piping tubes, so PVC tubes, that are covered in sandpaper to give me that reddy orangey colour, which was the red centre. The base is a bit of foam board or curl flute cut into a circle and again covered with the sandpaper. I have on the top section put the sandpaper on the inside of the pipe as well, just so that you don't see the grey of the pipe when you're looking down into the design from the top where the twigs are. So I really wanted to feature the roses in this design, and I've managed to get some roses that were the reddy orangey colour that is indicative of the red centre of Australia. The bark was to break up the structure a little bit so that it wasn't too dominant, and to indicate the dryness of the red centre of Australia as well. So let's now see what I should say first of all is this design placed second in the competition, and I was very happy with that because it really didn't turn out quite the way I wanted it to. I still felt the structure was a little bit too dominant. I didn't really know what else to do without spoiling the line of the design. So I'm interested to see what our DesignEye assessment tells us about improving the design as well. So let's now see what DesignEye had to say about this design. Looking at line, first of all, the design features a strong diagonal line created by the bold red cylindrical structure. This diagonal line is dynamic and adds a sense of movement to the composition. The bark wrapped around the cylinder adds curvilinear lines that soften the geometric rigidity of the cylinder, creating contrast and adding rhythm to the design. So exactly what I said, I wanted to use the bark to break up that structure. The linear twigs extending from the back of the cylinder continue this movement outward, directing the viewer's eye through and beyond the design. Bit risky, I think, because the twigs might have a tendency to throw you out of the design, but I think because of the dominance of the colour, you are drawn back to the design. So let's see now what DesignEye tells us about shape. The main shape in this design is geometric, with the cylindrical rediform acting as a strong focal shape. This contrasts sharply with the organic irregular shapes of the roses and the dried plant materials. The circular base reinforces the cylindrical structure, creating unity between the two shapes while visually grounding the composition. Now you can imagine what this would be like if it didn't have that round base underneath the cylinders. It would look out of place, and I think that despite how red the base is, that the structure itself, the plastic and the sandpaper covering would be far more dominant in the design. You would lose the roses and the bark and the twigs because of that dominance of that very strong geometric shape and the colour. Let's now look at form. The form of the design is three-dimensional with a prominent cylindrical structure that creates depth. The roses tucked into the cylinder add further dimension, giving the arrangement a sense of depth and volume. And this is part of what you need to look at when you're doing a design that is judged all around. You need to ensure that it is interesting from every angle and that it has got depth and volume from every angle as well. I know in the past I've said to you it's got to look interesting from every angle, but this explains further what we're saying when we talk about making it look interesting. It needs to have depth from every angle, and it needs to have volume from every angle, which doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot of material, but the sense needs to be portrayed. The inclusion of branches and bark provides texture and volume around the otherwise sleek cylinder, helping the form feel more natural and dynamic. Once again, as I said earlier, I'm a bit concerned about the twigs at the top. I would like to have brought them back down over that top cylinder a little bit more, but I might have lost that very strong diagonal line as well. So we'll wait and see at the end what it suggests as improvements. Let's look at texture now. There is a rich contrast in textures between the smooth, bold surface of the red cylinder and the rough, dry appearance of the bark and twigs. This contrast is essential in creating visual interest, which is interesting because the sandpaper itself is a rough texture, but because it's over such a very strong geometric shape, the roughness is not what comes through, it's the shape and the smoothness of that, the sense of smoothness that shape gives you because it's round. We don't often think of a round cylindrical shape being a rough texture. The roses themselves provide a soft velvety texture that contrasts beautifully with the rough and rustic materials surrounding them. Let's look now at colour. The bold deep red of the cylinder is the dominant colour in this composition. That's very true, and that was my concern, was that it was going to be too dominant for the rest of the design and it did make it difficult for me to feel that the composition was rhythmic and contained, because that red just jumps straight out at you. The red roses blend into this background, contributing to a monochromatic scheme, though their slightly softer peachy tones provide a subtle variation. The neutral tones of the bark and twigs offer contrast without competing with the vibrant red, while the green accents in the roses add a small pop of complementary colour. Probably not as obvious from this angle of the photo, but I did leave some of the foliage on the roses because I did want a little bit of green, because it's not all dry in the red centre of Australia. There is some green that happens after the rains particularly. It's interesting with the colour because I think that the strong colours in this design have really become the dominant part of the design rather than line or rhythm or any of the other elements that we might have considered as being the dominant parts of a design. Space now. The design makes use of both positive and negative space. The red cylinder occupies a significant amount of positive space, while the negative space between the twigs, bark and surrounding area helps create openness and avoids overcrowding. I still think the twigs are a bit overcrowded, but that's okay. The extension of the twigs outward from the base helps expand the space and around the design, adding airiness and making the overall arrangement feel less compact. I guess that's true. I'm not convinced. I just think it still looks a bit too compact for my liking, but it's just because that red is so dominant, and that's what just drawing me in each time is that space on the diagonal cylinder between the bark and where the twigs are, and it just, to me, on this image looks like a big blank space, and I get drawn to that rather than to anything else. But I am looking at a smaller image than it would have been in real life. So balance. The design is asymmetrical in its balance, with the bulk of the visual weight concentrated on the right side due to the angle of the cylinder and the roses emerging from it. This is an interesting thing for you to think about, is that visual weight is not always about what is in the design. It is what our eyes are drawn to as the prominent part of the design. So in this case, although you're drawn to where the roses are, to that side of the design. That's not where the bulk of the material is, because there's a lot more twigs and a lot more of the diagonal pipe in this design than is on the roses side. The left side, however, is balanced by the twigs extending outward, ensuring that the composition feels stable. The circular base helps ground the design, providing visual weight at the bottom to counteract the diagonal tilt of the cylinder. I am so glad that I added that base to this design. Initially, I didn't have it there, and I knew when I looked at it, when I staged it, I thought it just needs something else. It's just not quite right. And it was looking top heavy visually because of that strong diagonal line and the twigs and all of those things that are at the top of the design. And so I very quickly put together a base out of some foam board that I had with me and some extra of the sandpaper that was there. And in fact, some of the bark that is there is covering the gaps where I didn't have quite enough sandpaper to finish it off, but it all came together in the end, shall we say. So let's look now at contrast. The contrast between the smooth red cylinder and the rough organic materials, the bark and the twigs, creates visual interest. This textural contrast helps break up the otherwise minimalistic design and adds complexity. The colour contrast is less pronounced as the roses closely match the red cylinder. However, the slight variation in the hues of the roses and the natural colour of the leaves add enough distinction to avoid blending completely. So I think that that's probably something that I need to look at, is that there's textural contrast, but there's not a great deal of colour contrast. Now let's see what it says about emphasis. The cylinder is the primary focal point due to its size, bold colour and unusual diagonal placement. The roses peeking out of the cylinder provide a secondary focal point, drawing attention with their soft and natural appearance. The bark wrapped around the cylinder frames the roses subtly, guiding the viewer's eye towards the floral element without overpowering it. And I'm glad that happened, and as I have said all the way through, I really think I missed the boat by not having something a little bit higher up on that diagonal cylinder to soften that area, because it is still very much the focal point and it does draw my eye there, and I stop there. I just kind of get drawn back to where the roses are, but I'm fixated on that big blank space of red sandpaper at the moment. So rhythm. The rhythm is created by the repetition of the bark and twigs wrapping around the cylinder and extending outwards. This creates a flowing movement that leads the eye from the base of the design to the top and then outward, continuing the visual journey. The roses placed in a cluster provide a resting point within the rhythm, offering a moment of focus amidst the flowing dynamic elements. So this is interesting for you again to consider, that we often talk about don't let your eye travel out and away from the design, but keep it moving through the design. And what this assessment is saying is that you move through the design and there is opportunity for you to go out, but you're drawn back to the roses and you can rest at the roses and then come back into the design again. So it's an interesting way of keeping the viewing eye in the design. Unity. The design feels unified due to the repetition of materials and the use of a monochromatic colour scheme. The red cylinder and roses work harmoniously together, while the organic materials introduce a variety without disrupting the overall coherence of the piece. The circular base echoes the cylindrical form, helping to tie the entire composition together and providing a sense of cohesion. This is why I keep going back to use a base in your designs, or have something at the bottom of the design that brings everything together, or that you incorporate into the design, because it does frame the design, it grounds the design, it gives the viewing eye a starting point and an ending point for the design. So always, I think, consider something that you've got around the base of your design to finish it off. What it also does, and we forget to mention it sometimes, is that a base like that lifts your design away from the staging area. If I didn't have that base in the design, then the staging area would be visually become part of the design, and you don't want that, because that can change the balance and the cohesion and the unity of your design. Proportions. Now, the proportions of the design are well considered. The large red cylinder takes up the majority of the space, but the roses and plant materials are in proportion to the cylinder, ensuring that nothing feels too dominant or out of place. Well, I take exception to that. I still think the top of that diagonal container is too dominant. The small cluster of roses offers a delicate balance to the boldness of the cylindrical structure, softening the overall look. And that's a very important thing to consider when you're looking at plant material, particularly when you're restricted to one kind of flower, that you consider how that flower, that plant material will contribute to the overall design that you're putting together. Let's now look at some suggestions from DesignEye to see what we could do. Colour contrast. Replace the current roses with a darker or lighter variation like burgundy or yellow to create a stronger colour contrast against the red cylinder. I think I'd go with yellow. I think I'd have a real pop of colour because yellow, once again, is a colour that is part of the red centre. But I was fixated on this red centre and the oranges and the reds, and a different colour contrast would give it a striking moment in that area. Flow enhancement. Arrange the twigs in a more cohesive and flowing direction, either angling them to mirror the diagonal flow of the cylinder or curving them gently to echo the bark. I think that's very much the case. I think I needed to focus a little bit more on what I was doing with those twigs at that end of the design. Texture refinement. Use the bark more deliberately, perhaps by creating spirals or wrapping it more tightly around the cylinder in a repetitive fashion. I might consider the spirals, but I wouldn't wrap it more repetitively because I didn't want that very formal structure finish. I wanted the rougher, more organic finish to the placement of the bark. Twig proportion. Trim the twigs to reduce their visual weight and keep them more proportionate to the roses and cylinder. And I think that giving them a bit of space is going to help it as well. So there we have our assessment and our suggestions from AI for our design red centre. If you would like one of your designs assessed, you can do that very easily by just submitting an image to the website, and within about 24 hours you'll get an assessment like this back. Each of the DesignEye assessments is reviewed by a human judge, floral art judge, before it is sent to you, just to make sure that it's got all of the things in it that will help you in your floral art journey. So until next time, let's enjoy our journey together. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.